Good evening, everyone. We're going to get underway. So I'm Tom Brake, the Director of Unlock Democracy, and this event tonight is being hosted by Unlock Democracy and Make Votes Matter. And we're very fortunate to have an outstanding panel and a fantastic chair. And that is all I'm going to say, apart from thanking you all for coming. Enjoy the evening, and as long as we haven't finished the drinks, there may be time for more drinks on the terrace when the event is finished. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Sangita.
Hello, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to be here this evening. It's interesting, this question of PR. Somebody asked me, I think it was you, Maria, asked me, why are you here? Are you interested in it? And I said, of course, I'm not interested in proportional representation. I've worked in newsroom for 20 years.
All right. Typical journalist. Typical.
Absolutely. And that, I think, ladies and gentlemen, sums up the issue that all of you in this room have had when it comes to engaging the general public with the question of voter reform. I would, however, say, and it's not just because I'm in the room with you, I think we have reached a moment. And I say that based on the fact last night I was in a room with lots and lots of very young voters, people who have not been traditionally engaged with politics, all of whom said the following: they feel disenfranchised. They are fed up with the establishment, who they feel aren't listening to them, and they think their votes are worthless. And I genuinely believe that if we are to have constitutional reform that brings about a new voting system in this country, it will happen within the next 10 years, or possibly never. So we have this evening to explore those ideas and many others. I'm absolutely delighted to say we have an excellent panel with us to discuss that. So the man who needs no introduction whatsoever, but I'll give one to him anyway, Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and National Centre for Social Research, the UK in a Changing Europe. We have also, to my right, Hardeep Matharu, editor of the excellent Byline Times, and Maria Iacovou. I've been practicing this, so inevitably I've got this wrong. Maria Iacovou, correct? Thank you. Who is, of course, Professor of Quantitative Sociology at the University of Cambridge. I promised to put my teeth back in now. We're going to start this evening with a presentation from John. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Because I'm giving a presentation and because the screen is over there, I'm just going to come forward a bit. So my apologies to my fellow panelists for, I'll try and stand where I'm not standing right in front of you. Okay. What I'm going to do is two things, but two things in a way that, to some degree at least, stands back from the immediate drama and considers at least a couple of the longer term implications of what may be about to unfold before us in a couple of weeks' time, and implications in particular that are probably of interest to those of you in this room. So I guess one probably does need to warn the Liberal Democrats in this room that you might have to start being a bit sympathetic to the Conservative Party, but we'll get there. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the campaign and where the campaign has got us to, and then I'm going to talk towards the end about some of this MRP polling, which have been 3 more literally out in the last hour or so, which I've not fully absorbed, but they kind of give you the similar message. So this is the dynamics of the polls in this parliament. It's been an unusual parliament in that we would normally expect the government to do quite well at the beginning, which this government did, but that was because of the pandemic. And then it does some unpopular things and it usually falls behind the opposition. And then the question as you get towards the end of the parliament is whether or not they can recover or not. Now, difficult though it might be to remember, but for the first 2 years of this parliament, the Conservative government was never consistently behind Labour in the polls. That blue line was never more than equal with the red line. No, you're too fast on me. No, I'm not that quick. He obviously wants this over quickly. It's Chris Whitty's style. You have to wait for the instruction. Now, you can see the crossover. I bet you can guess when the crossover point was. Partygate, yeah. The first stories about Partygate appeared in December 2021. And in a matter of 6 weeks, the Tories lost 6 points and they fell behind the Labour Party in the polls. And no prize for the second one. Distrust. Yeah, absolutely. These are the two defining events of this parliament. It's the first time in post-war British politics that we've lost 2 prime ministers as a result of their parliamentary party dumping them. And no government that's presided over a market crisis has ever survived at the ballot box. So, the odds were frankly stacked against the Conservatives before that, but they didn't make life any easier for themselves. I wonder if you can work out that one. Do you know what that one is? What is the point at which the modest Conservative recovery under Sunak disappears? No. Yes? The Privileges Committee report saying that Boris Johnson misled the House of Commons. Yes, absolutely. They didn't get it. Boris Johnson's got it. He's going on holiday. But his party didn't. And this is the last 6 months, which is the advance of reform, which coincides roughly with the Conservatives' decision to focus on immigration as one of their principal issues during the dying days of the Parliament. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, he's disappeared. He's on. Right. Now, this is what happened during the campaign. I did this yesterday. This is somewhere between 20 and 21. The polls keep on coming out. I think this has now slipped to 41, but it doesn't make a fundamental difference. So the Conservatives decided to call this election 20 points behind. They are still at least 20 points behind on average in the polls, but far from going up and narrowing the lead, they have gone backwards. It's just that Labour have gone down a bit as well. That's partly to do with changes in methodology in the polls. But the decisive event of this campaign was Nigel Farage's decision to intervene, what is it now, just over 2.5 weeks ago, and to become the leader of reform. And as you can see, it was already the case that the Conservatives were failing to squeeze the already 11% reform vote. That in itself was a big problem for the Conservatives. But with Farage coming on the scene and pushing it up to 16% on average, at least in the regular polls, that just made their problem even worse. Okay, so now let's just pause, because we all focus on this big lead. 21%. One, have the Conservatives ever previously been this low in the opinion polls? Answer, no. They are now at a record low. Two, have the Conservatives ever ended up with 21% in the ballot boxes in a general election? Well, certainly not since the First World War. And that means that I think one of the things that you guys need to be thinking about, next slide, please, is that you'll remember the arguments that we were used to be having from about the 1960s onwards, that gradually the share of the vote being accumulated by the 2 largest parties seemed to be in long-term decline. And then, of course, the Liberal Democrats went into coalition with the Labour Party, with the Conservatives, reneged on tuition fees, and the rest was history. But this is just taking those recent 2 figures. We are potentially heading towards the lowest combined 2-party share, where the 2 largest parties in electoral history since 1922. Oh, by the way, the other thing just to bear in mind, this is the first election at which 5 political parties have fought virtually every seat inside the UK. So insofar as some of your arguments are predicated on the fact that an electoral system which is designed for 2 parties, that's in itself debatable, but anyway, it's designed for 2 parties, given the fragmentation that we may now get in terms of votes, and certainly the fragmentation we have now got in terms of organized politics. That is something you probably should be thinking about. Next slide, please. Now, what's happened to the Tories? Why are they in so much trouble? Well, you can see what's happened. When Liz Truss originally vacated Downing Street, the vast bulk of Tory voters that were defecting were going to Labour. But from last autumn, the figure we're going to reform was going up to around 1 in 5, and it's now just over 1 in 4, whereas the proportion going to Labour is just stuck at about 1 in 6. But reform are the principal destination of 2019 Conservative voters who've changed their minds. This is one of the many reasons why the rise of reform is such a problem for the Conservative Party. Now, the Conservative Party's response to this has been to say, if you vote for Nigel Farage, you'll get Keir Starmer. Next slide, please. This is how effective this argument is going to be with Reform voters. This is Reform voters being asked, which government do you prefer? Conservative, Labour, or neither of them? They're both as bad as each other. Now, you know, give the Tories credit, they are quite right that very few Reform voters look with equanimity at the prospect of Sir Keir Starmer being Prime Minister. But frankly, they don't think much more of the Tories either. And this is one of many numbers in this particular poll of Reform voters that YouGov did that shows that basically this argument is not looking as though it's going to work. That basically Reform voters are happy to bring the house down because they think the house is no longer worth the foundations on which it stands, and they will put up with Labour being in power as the price of that happening. Next slide, please. All of this said, there is a lot of debate going on in polling land about exactly how this election is going to pan out. And one of the sources of uncertainty is summed up by this slide, which is that many more voters who voted Conservative in 2019 are currently saying that they don't know what they're going to do, and it's true of 2019 Labour voters. And some people have seized off and said, well, look, at these folk will go back. And if they go back, the lead will narrow. That's true, the lead will narrow if they go back. Actually, if they all go back, it will narrow the lead by about 5 points. However, this is a symptom, not a remedy. It's a symptom of a party that's in trouble, not an automatic remedy. Yes, who are most likely to go back? It is the don't knows. But some of us remember being in many a meeting like this between 2010 and 2015, when the Liberal Democrat spokesman, it might have even been Tom Brake, would pipe up and say, it's all right. They just say they don't know. They will come back to us. And as Tom can witness, they did not come back at all. And the Liberal Democrats suffered. Also, by the way, the experience of the Liberal Democrats in 2015 is also relevant to the second part of this talk as well. So now, what is part of the debate in polling land is, should we attempt to either weight the data in such a way that it doesn't assume that basically don't know is just going to vote like those people who declare a preference, or do we actually try to impute, i.e. guess what these voters are going to do? And some of the companies are doing either one of those other two things, and they do tend to be the companies that produce somewhat narrow leads. But who, on the other hand, other companies, if you say don't know, ask you a follow-up question. Come on, look, give us an idea. And the companies that do that and get their don't knows down to virtually zero don't actually have particularly smaller Conservative leads. So that's an area of uncertainty. Okay, on to part two. Next slide, please. So this is the standard cephalogist way of looking at how our existing electoral system operates so far as the two largest parties are concerned. And it's basically saying what would happen if support for Conservative and Labour were to go up and go down by the same amount everywhere, while support for the Liberal Democrats and all the other third parties was unchanged. And the crucial line of this is this one here. If the electoral geography of the 2019 election were to remain undisturbed, i.e. where parties do better and where they do worse, the Labour Party needs, according to this calculation, on the new boundaries, nearly a 14-point lead over the Conservatives to get to a majority of 2. And you might then say, well, the narrowest polls, 17-point lead, not that much above 14. Maybe we'll get a hung parliament, which was certainly what the Prime Minister seemed to think after the local elections. However, this brings us to the so-called MRP polls, and I've got a couple of them here that came out before today, but it will illustrate the point. So this is the one that, not the YouGov's one today, which has the Tories at 115, but the one a couple of weeks ago. And so this is the share of the vote for the parties in this particular mega poll. And it's very similar to that of other polls at the same time. This is their projection of seats. Now, how is this done? Well, basically, you do a really big mega poll. And because you've got a mega poll, you can start estimating how different groups of voters are likely to vote. So you can take men between 65 and 75 who are graduates, who are living in the north of England or whatever, right? And because of census data and otherwise, you know how many of each of these demographic groups there are in each constituency. So basically, for every demographic group, you can calculate a probability of voting for a party. You can then multiply that by the number of people in that group in every constituency according to the census, and lo and behold, you get an estimate of what's going to happen in each seat from an otherwise national poll. Now, the crucial bit to note for you is this. This is what YouGov was saying was going to happen. This is what you would have got if you had used that standard assumption, which I did in the previous table. In other words, the electoral system looks as though it's going to work against the Conservatives as compared with 2019. And if we go to the next slide, please, this explains why this is the case, because this is seats which are basically marginal between Conservative and Labour. These are the seats that Labour need to pick up to get to 326. Tory vote down, according to this projection, just over 21 points. But it's less than the number here, which are the seats that take Labour into clear majority land, down 26 points. But both numbers are an awful lot bigger than the decline in the Labour vote in this poll, which is the order of 15 points. Sorry, the decline in the Conservative vote in Labour held seats. All right. Now, Liberal Democrats in this room will know this is not the pattern you want. Your vote going down more heavily in places where you were previously strongest, which is also exactly what happened to Liberal Democrats in 2015 when their vote fell very, very heavily as compared with the previous position in 2010. So it's partly an arithmetical inevitability. There are about 80 constituencies where the Conservatives did not get 20% of the vote in 2019, and therefore they cannot lose 20 points this time, which is what the national polls are saying. Oh, yeah, I know. As I said to you, you're going to have to start being sympathetic to the Conservative Party. But this is also what's going on. Reform are advancing most strongly in Tory territory, particularly very safe Tory territory. That's partly because they're Leave areas, but it is also because, remember, Nigel Farage pulled his candidates out of Conservative seats in 2019. So in all of these seats, the Reform, anything Reform get is plus on 0. And that does the Tories an awful lot of damage. Next slide, please. This was Survation's one. This is one of the bigger ones, 83, although this evening Savanta has come up with 55, and I think they've got Rishi Sunak losing his seat. But anyway, this is what their poll actually had a narrower Labour lead, and as compared with the uniform movement assumption, there's an enormous difference. The difference is bigger because, next slide, as you can see, the differences in Conservative support, according to this estimate, is rather bigger than it was in the YouGov one. And this is, again, one of the uncertainties in polling line. Just how, it's pretty clear, because we know even what happened in the local elections, that something like this pattern is going to exist. The question is, how big will it be? And that's one of the things that pollsters are worrying about, and also helps to explain why, again, this evening, we've got one poll with the Tories at around 150 odd, and another one saying it's about 50. This is where this divergence is arising from. Next slide, please. Now, why is all of this relevance to arguments about electoral reform? It's of relevance because, as well as potentially moving towards the smallest share of the two-party vote being commanded by the two largest parties, we may also be heading for the most disproportional result in certainly post-war British politics. This is a so-called index of disproportionality. It's very, very simple. You add up, you calculate for each party the difference between their share of the votes and their share of the seats, and add them all up, irrespective of whether it's plus or minus, and then divide by 2. Called the Loosemore-Hanby index, if you really want to know. Now, this when the Liberal Democrats were doing well, or indeed when UKIP did well in 2015 and got only one seat, this index was at a high level. Indeed, 2015 is the record at the moment, an index of 24. 1983, when the Alliance did very badly out of the system, almost as high, 23. But with the collapse of the Liberal Democrats and the collapse of UKIP, then, and with the vote being quite close between Tory and Labour, we've got relatively small index disproportionality. The YouGov poll that I've just shown you looks at would point to a disproportionality of 24. The Savanta one to 30. The Ipsos one yesterday 29. The YouGov one this evening is 27. So the other thing to realize we may be heading for is the most disproportional election yet. But actually within that, which is why I'm saying you're going to have to be nice to the Tories, is that perhaps the Liberal Democrats will end up with roughly their proportionate share, given how badly the Tories are doing and given the evidence that there's some tactical voting kicking in. So for example, tonight's YouGov, you've got 11% of the seats for 12% of the vote. So you can't complain anymore, guys. But the Tories, with what is it, 22% of the vote, but only getting about 17% of the seats, the system's now really beginning to work against them. But the broader point is that we may now have the most disproportional election and the most fragmented election ever. And so it may be time for you guys to think through what your arguments are going to be in what may now be a rather different environment. Oh, and by the way, some of us do remember until the Falklands War rescued Margaret Thatcher, that there was an awful lot of interest inside the Conservative Party on electoral reform.
Sir John Curtice, thank you very much indeed. A round of applause, please. Lots and lots to pick up with John, but before I come to the audience, I do want to hear first from Hardeep Matharu, if you are willing. We have just heard John say that this is the most disproportionate and fragmented election ever. That coming against a landscape of essentially a two-party race for as long as you and I have been alive. What do you think this says about the political culture in the UK at the moment? And what are your reflections on how that relates to the desire or momentum potentially for electoral reform?
It's great to be here with you all today. And I'm a journalist, not an expert on tactical voting or PR. So these are just some observations, really. I always like to put more questions out there than answers. Perhaps rarely as a journalist, I don't think I know everything about everything. I think
you in a very small group of journalists.
I think it is a very interesting moment, and I hope that in the talk of the potential for electoral reform and proportional representation and the limits or the complications of the two-party system, we see this as part of a wider conversation that needs to be had about our democracy and how we need to frame some of those discussions, you know, because I think it's much more than just about PR and proportional representation as a voting system. It's about, as you say, Sangita, the entire culture of our democracy. Do people really feel that it works for them? Do the younger generations even feel that it is democratic in that their voice is being heard? And part of this conversation, and I always say this because it's always the elephant in the room, but you've hinted at it. This conversation about democracy cannot be separated from a conversation that needs to be had about our media, in particular the established press in this country. And Byline Times, of which I'm the editor of, we are independent. We sit outside of the political party system. We're funded by 40,000 subscribers. And a main body of our work is about holding the established press, which has a lot of power, which is not a neutral force in this country, to account and bringing some scrutiny to it. And I think that's important because I always say, you know, regardless of how people voted in the EU referendum, one, it's questionable whether we would have had the result we had if it wasn't for the ways in which the campaigns were run with misleading statements and how that was projected by the media, but also the very hard Brexit that we ended up with. And I always say, would we have ended up in the position we were over an issue such as Brexit, a huge constitutional change for this country, if it wasn't for Britain's established press? So I think this conversation cannot be seen as separate from democracy, and we cannot be afraid to talk about this, because it's just pretty obvious to me. But I think to your question about the political culture, it's interesting because we talk a lot about the impact on voters and members of the public, the electorate, and I think that's very important, and a lot of what I want to say is about that. But I also think this two-party system, it keeps a lot of good people out of politics that we think should be in it, because there is this notion of you have to become part of a tribal two-party system. And I think we're missing lots of people with lots of talent and ideas and a diversity of representation, importantly, a diversity of thought within politics, because a lot of people see this as a tribal adversarial system that they don't want to get involved with. I think, as you've said, Sangita, I think many people feel disengaged by our current system, especially younger generations. They don't feel that their voice is really being heard because their vote may or may not count. I think there's apathy. And I think that there is a general sense that no matter who you vote for, it's broadly going to remain the same. So it's either a Labour government or a Conservative government, notwithstanding the moment that John has described. I think there is there's always a notion that it's always the same thing, and therefore there might be an appetite for something different. But I also think that our adversarial system is an us and them system. And when you talk about the political culture, I think that's where it really impacts. You know, there isn't this notion that there could be any complexity or understanding of the need for compromise or holding contradiction or nuance or something deeper within our politics or collaboration. That's not the nature of it. It's about sort of a world view of how this country should be run, which is either completely right or completely wrong, and there's little in between. And I think that gives people the impression that there is a performative type of oppositional debate, which our politics becomes, which you see through things like PMQs and that is quite far removed. We know that bubble of Westminster is quite far removed from people and their lives and how they think politics should be run.
I agree, and I want to come back to you in a few moments about that. I completely agree with you. When we're talking about political culture, there is no way to distinguish, in my view, politics and politicians and the way in which the media reports politics and politicians, because that is what creates the narrative that we then all discuss in the general public. So great point. We'll come back to that. Maria, we've heard actually a rather good exposition, if you don't mind me saying, from Hardeep about that difficult relationship. We've heard from two journalists on the panel here that we both feel that this is a moment, and we're picking that up in the general public. What evidence is there that there is a moment for change? Is there any at all?
Well, thanks for that question. And it's great to be here, by the way. I think there is excellent evidence that this is a moment. And, you know, just probably everybody in the room, everybody online has got anecdotes of, you know, people just feeling sort of hopeless and like the system isn't working. But actually, there's better evidence than that. So another report, which, John, you didn't talk about, but I think you were an author of, which is from the British Social Attitudes Survey, looking at people's, you know, level of satisfaction with the political system, shows that it has been declining. And over recent cycles of the British Social Attitudes Survey, there has been sort of speculation that it might be a blip. It might be something, it might be related to Brexit, it might be something else. But what we are seeing now is all-time low levels of dissatisfaction with the political system. And so, and that is your moment. Not, all-time low levels of trust in politicians, of trust that politicians would tell the truth, of trust that political parties would act in the national interest rather than their own interest. I mean, the evidence is absolutely there. In tandem with that, you also have a majority of the public being in favor of a change to the electoral system, and specifically to a change in to proportional representation. And again, there is good evidence for that. So I think that the figures in that report were something like 53% to 40%, again, something like this. So yeah, the evidence is absolutely there. I think it's great that there are journalists in the room, by the way.
Well, rarely hear that. Thank you very much indeed. So you say that there is evidence. John, I heard you just chip in there.
Yeah, well,
How significant is it, though?
Well,
are we talking about a marginal change over?
No,
a
no,
2-year
okay.
period?
So,
Are we
so
talking
this is
about a
British.
10-year
This is British sociology. The question goes all the way back to 1983, and it's a question which historically has tended to produce a majority of the current system. So the wording is literally, which these things come closer to your view. We should keep the current electoral system in order to have strong government, or we should change the electoral system in order to make the system fairer to small parties. And that particular wording has tended to produce majorities for the first option. But there has been an increase in recent years. Now, I think, however, you're going to have to realize as a group, and this is pretty fundamental, most of that increase is the result of people who support the Labour Party changing their views. And of course, the Labour Party is now officially in favour of proportional representation, although Sir Keir Starmer is not interested in it. One of the challenges that you will now have is that, given what we know happened when the last time the Labour Party landslide in 1997, when it was committed to having the Commission on Alternative Electoral System, which was indeed created and Roy Jenkins chaired, but then curiously we never had the referendum that was meant to come at the end of all of that. One suspects that Labour supporters will change their mind if the result is anything like what we're anticipating, which is partly now. I mean, the problem you always have about this subject is that it's always the folk who lose who want to change the system. And what you really want is to get to the point where those who win want to change the system. And that will be the challenge over the next few years. And again, I mean, to link the 2 points Maria was talking about, you can also show that people who don't trust politicians are more likely to be in favor of electoral reform. These things are related. So, disappointment with how our politicians are engaging with the public is related to support for electoral reform. And that is in place, even if you take into account people's partisanship.
Thank you. Just to remind you, your moment is coming soon to ask questions, so please do get that ready. When we get to that point, I'm going to be asking you to raise your hands in the old traditional way, and somebody will come around with a microphone and we can take that. So whilst you think about what your questions are, both online and here in the room, I do have a burning question. We have heard a lot in the press recently about the rise of far-right parties in European elections. What I hear very often is a deep-seated sense amongst voters in this country that they don't want to see that here, and that they link the rise of the far right in terms of having actual political power or holding the balance of power directly connected to systems of proportional representation. How problematic is this, in your view, in trying to persuade the UK electorate that PR is a good thing? Let's take it.
Well, I hate to mention it in this room, but Reform are in favour of proportional representation. Now, you then have to argue about whether or not you think that Reform is a far-right party or not, and we could have an interesting debate about that. But I think the history of reform of political institutions is the law of unintended consequences. You don't necessarily know how things are going to pan out. And particularly if we were to introduce proportional representation now in a situation where you've got once upon a time, it just looked like the Lib Democrats' pet cause because they were the only obvious potential beneficiaries, right? Now, however, with 5 parties competing with more than 5% of the GB-wide vote, with also then, the S&P, although weaker at the moment, but still by historical standards, much stronger, you're going to end up with a much more fragmented system than ever been the case. And it's certainly worth going back in 2015, the consequence of proportional representation would have been the Conservatives reliant on UKIP. And I think that's just something you have to appreciate. But on the other hand, insofar as you're going to create a movement that has broad support, then actually the Eurosceptic movement is a potential source of support for changing the system.
Suddenly food for thought. Maria.
Can't choose your friends always in politics.
Yeah, so this is definitely something that is going to be present in the debate. And it is certainly true, and we can't deny it.
Okay, but why is it then when I mention this to people who are supportive of PR, they get really nervous and stressed and would rather I didn't ask it?
Okay, I think we have, the answers have to be ready, and they are there. So it is definitely the case that if and when proportional representation is introduced in the UK, that some far-right parties will gain some seats, and that is just absolutely incontrovertible. The question is that too high a price to pay for a political system that actually works to represent people? Now, I would argue that it isn't, because in fact, what we have at the moment is that we have we've got a far-right government already, and they've got a huge parliamentary majority. And the Conservative Party in the UK hasn't always been characterisable as a far-right party, but I would say now that the Conservative Party's policies on immigration, for example, are quite typical of what we see as, from far-right parties across Europe. So the question is not whether it would be just absolutely awful for far-right parties to gain, 1 to 2 seats, or, a handful of seats, but, the price we pay for not having that is having a far-right government in power for decades. Well, I know which I prefer.
Hardeep, thoughts?
I mean, in very interesting comments, and I think what I have to say sort of carries on from that. I mean, on a more philosophical level, I mean, democracy is about plurality, isn't it? It actually is about having to accommodate elements that we may not agree with and that we find uncomfortable. I think what our first past the post system does, though, in this country, is that we don't really have that plurality within the system itself, but it still exists, to take Maria's point. Like it's still there and it still has an influence. And I think then the question perhaps is, do we want to engage with it head on, or do we want to allow such sentiments that do exist, hard right, far right sentiments that do exist in this country,
but I think
to remain in the
not so much
shadows?
that it's about whether or not far-right parties might one day hold the balance of
the balance of power. Yeah, exactly. Which is, and I think that's no,
we've seen quite a few unlikely
exactly
things, I would argue, over the last
holding
5
the
years.
balance of power. Yeah, but I think it is about assessing. I mean, I'm not advocating for a change or not, but it would be about assessing what is the price people are willing to pay, because at the same time, is it the case that there is perhaps a progressive majority in this country that isn't adequately reflected under first past the post, but you'd have a proportional system with, yes, maybe a balance of power in some circumstances, but many more progressive candidates who would counterbalance that? I don't know. But what I would say is that we have a Conservative Party who arguably has been dragged further to the right by a force that is still there, that doesn't have official representation. Call it UKIP, the Brexit Party, Farage. And is that something we want? Do we want a very small base of Conservative Party members who are not representative of the country as a whole, who are much further to the right than most people in this country, picking leader after leader and dragging the whole country to the right, which happens anyway? So again, but I do think this is very important, Sangita, to this point. I especially think it's important for minorities in this country. Democracy is about rights for minorities and protecting that. But the inherent tension in democracy is that the plurality of the system allows in elements that could undermine it. And I think then it's about the wider culture and how we have or we don't have the safeguards in place to manage that adequately, so it doesn't undermine the very system that it's operating within.
Thank you. Questions from the floor? Gentleman, oh, your hand was so fast. Gentleman in the greenish grey suit.
Just on that last point, I'd say it's more likely out of the first past the post to have a far-right party having the ability to have the balance of power, because in a proportional representation, there'll be other parties which will be able to fill the gap to form a majority. But my question is about the next point about PR is going to be coalitions. Now, Susanna and I went to a meeting in Putney, and Nick Clegg was there, who was returned to live at my house in Putney, and he was in dialogue with the Lib Dem candidate. And he said the thing that he found out about the coalition she was in was this country is not ready for coalitions, because, as you said at the outset, Lib Dem got destroyed because they had to allow a small issue about tuition fees. And he said not only was it the party not ready, the country not ready, his party of Lib Dems were not ready. The fact that when you go into coalition, you've got to make compromises. And you can't demand, particularly as the minority party, to follow your own particular policies. So I think what we've got to do is learn, and what I'd like to hear from the panel is, how are we going to educate the country to say coalition is going to require not just compromise in voting, but compromise in government?
Maria Iacovou, this feels like a question for you.
Gosh, yes. I mean, I suppose, one answer to that is just, how do you learn how to do coalitions? And the answer is, well, you just practice, you just do them. And, and then you learn. In terms of, so I hear that this was Nick Clegg saying this to you, and he's the person that should know. But, in retrospect, there could have been some things that the Lib Dems could have done in that coalition, and they could have said so far and no further on a couple of key things, because in a parliamentary coalition, you always have the right to do that. And in fact, that is one of the things that provides checks and balances to a parliamentary system, that does not let the major party, the main party in a coalition, get away with whatever it is that they want to get away with, is that the other coalition partner or partners will rein them in a bit if it's all going a bit too far. And in that case, the Lib Dems did not do that.
I do think this is a very interesting answer and a very interesting question, because it goes to the heart of what the psychology is of both voters and politicians.
Yeah, but I think Mr. Clegg is rewriting history a little bit here. All right. Okay, so you're right, coalition involves compromise. But one of the reasons why the Liberal Democrats were happy to compromise on that issue is that because neither Nick Clegg nor Vince Cable believed in the policy that their party advocated, and in so doing failed to realize that actually symbolically it was particularly important to the party's base of support. So this is a classic case of politicians pursuing their own ideological perspective and failing to understand the nature of the electoral support that got them into the position that they were able to actually engage in compromise.
Well, they were accused of being sellouts, I think is the
Yeah,
is the
but
generally
this is the
way of,
point. You have to be careful.
describing
You have
that.
to be careful what you compromise about, right? Now, part of the problem was the way in which their coalition was formed very quickly, and then basically they were given the coalition agreed a set of reduced spending totals for all the departments, and then point was Bayes then had to work out what it was going to do, and by that point the pass was sold, because there wasn't enough room within Bayes' budget to maintain their stance on tuition fees. I mean, I think the room for compromise might have been some increase in the tuition fee, but going to 9,000 quid and basically going to a point where therefore the state was no longer funding the tuition of students on the arts and social science side and therefore paying the full cost. That was just so much of a pass. Whereas if they'd gone for a modest increase and say it's still our aspiration to get rid of it, but in the current second, they might have been able to reduce the damage. But it wasn't a compromise. You said it was a sellout in all practical purposes. No, sure, but you have to be careful about what you compromise about, right? And, you know, and the other thing we know about that coalition is that the Conservatives were extremely well prepared for the coalition talks. They knew what they were after, and they by the end of the day knew the contents of the Democrat manifesto better than the Democrats did themselves.
I'd like to just. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I was going to ask Hardeep whether it's a tough one, but it's, you know, we've heard it from the politician side. From what you're picking up as in your work as the editor of Byline Times, do you think the public is in a place psychologically to accept that PR would deliver coalitions, potentially, and that would involve an awful lot of compromise?
I think the public at large is very disengaged from the entire political system. And for the majority of people in this country, our fellow citizens, politics is not about politics, not about policy at all. And I do think there is some deeper sociological understanding that's necessary. But on this point about coalitions, I think the country is perhaps ready for a conversation that our democracy isn't working, which is something I think they viscerally understand from things like Partygate, the coronavirus pandemic, the mortgages going up under Liz Truss. So I think they're ready for that. The specifics of coalitions and trying to make them understand that we're suddenly going to go from this adversarial system that it's just the water we swim in, whether we like it or not. They might have these opinions about it and think, oh, nothing ever changes, it's just two parties. But it is the water they swim in and have swum in for years. And so to try to convince them, especially with a right-wing established press, which will continue to exert influence, saying that this is all a big plot of ultimate wokery to change the electoral system, I think those two things combined means it is a challenge. So I think people are at the point where they think things don't work, but trying to get them to the point of even explaining coalitions, because it's not just coalitions, it's about the entire political culture, which requires compromise and contradiction and collaboration. And all they really know is two very middle class, upper class, white privileged men stand up in Parliament once a week on a Wednesday and just shout things at each other that is nothing really to do with them.
And I think they also understand broken promises. And I do feel that whilst people may not have the minutiae of a manifesto to hand, what they understand is if you're somebody who stands for number 10 and promises, for example, honesty, integrity, and professionalism, and you don't deliver that, that is something that the general public, even those not politically engaged, can understand. That's a broken promise because we have experienced those in our everyday lives. I know you're dying to jump in. I would like to get to some questions online. We have about 1,500 people, I think, watching, and then so we will take your questions. Should we take a couple of questions from you, and then we'll get the panel to perhaps just be quite concise in their answers so we can get through more questions, please.
I'll also just quickly say on behalf of the people online, if speakers can keep the microphone nice and close to their faces, just because there's some people having trouble hearing. But two questions that have been coming up online, one about turnout. So what role might that play in this election? Could that affect the polling accuracy, etc.? And another one that's come up quite a lot, what are the chances of the Conservatives no longer being the second party after this election?
Two very good questions. I'm going to go over to you first, John. One or both? Which one would you like to answer? Both?
I'll do the turnout one. The answer is yes and no to so far about turnout in polling. One of the problems that the pollsters face these days is that there's a very strong relationship between age and which party people support. Younger people vote Labour, older people vote Conservative. And there has always been a strong relationship between age and the probability of people turning out to vote. So therefore, it's become much more important pollsters to be able to estimate accurately the age differences in levels of turnout. Because the people who answer polls, including the younger people who answer polls, tend to be more politically engaged. So you therefore tend to underestimate the age differences in turnout, and that means you're at risk of overestimating Labour support. And that's one of the reasons why the polls were wrong back in 2015. One of the things that's now going on is that pollsters are increasingly not relying on their own polls to estimate the age differences in turnout. They tried some tricks back in 2017, and that led them up the garden path in the other direction of underestimating Labour. But they're increasingly relying on high quality academic surveys and basically using the data from the last one of those for the last election in order to basically work out, to rely on that as their estimate of the age difference in turnout. I basically assume it's largely going to be constant from the last election. But that is one of the other areas that the pollsters place. More broadly, I suspect we're going to get a low turnout in this election, but whether it will make any difference to the result, probably not. I can give you perfectly good reasons why both Labour, potential Labour and Tory supporters are likely to stay at home.
John, thank you. Maria Iacovou, are we looking at the, I mean, this is existential, this election of the Conservative Party, isn't it? What are the chances that it will be the second party? Or will it just annihilate?
It's ever so, the microphone's still working.
No,
Yep, okay. It's ever so difficult to, well, it's difficult for me to predict. John might have a slightly better idea. But I would like to say, in terms of turnout, this is really interesting because in the UK, and this is partly to do with first past the post voting system, actually, compared with other countries, we already have really low turnout. And that is a feature of first past the post, and you don't have to be a genius to work out why. That, you know, in a voting system where loads of people's votes don't count, lots of people don't bother going out to vote. If you live in a safe seat, you know, why would you bother turning out to vote? So voter turnout is already low in this country. It's likely to be extremely low or even historically low at this election. And if I can just sort of drop something else into this answer as well, which is that when we look at voter turnout, we look at people who are registered to vote, and we sort of forget about the people who are not registered to vote in the first place. And again, in this country, it's very high, and it tends to be high among people who are young, urban, move house a lot, not very affluent, etc., etc. So when you put together all of the people who are not registered to vote in the first place, all the people who feel that there is nothing in it for them to, you know, to bother going out to vote, when you factor in as well all the people who feel that their best option is to vote tactically for a party they don't even support, all of these things kind of contribute to, you know, what you were calling a moment or a crisis. And so I think it's really important not just to look at turnout, but to look at all of those things together.
Hardeep, given the fact that what John was saying earlier in his presentation is that disaffected Tory voters are most likely, particularly in the red wall, to turn to reform, what are your thoughts on whether or not the Conservative Party will in fact be the second party? Or do you think that this is possibly the end of that and the rise of another form of conservatism?
I'll leave it to the experts to talk about the projections, whether it's a second party or not. But yes, I mean, I do think it's a seminal moment for the Conservatives, seminal moment. I think Nigel Farage has been very clever 2.5 weeks ago, standing up and saying the election's done, Labour has won, the Conservative brand is over. I do think that there could be a significant realignment, a complete shake-up of politics, because not just because of the loss of votes for the Conservatives and the seats, but it will be very interesting to see what direction the party takes. My suspicion is it won't be snatched back from the right by the One Nation faction. I think it will go further to the right. And I think it is extremely worrying in all of the talk of a massive Labour majority to come, that the reality may well be that we will have a mainstream far-right opposition party in this country. And I think that will have considerable implications for the pressure on the government that is about to be elected to deliver something that actually changes people's lives in a tangible way that they can feel and makes a good attempt to clean up politics. Because I do think that those politicians on the hard right, the current Conservatives, I think they're going to go further that way. They're going to look to Europe, Viktor Orban. They are going to look to the Republicans, the MAGA faction. who followed Trump in the United States. And that is the way it's going. That's what we've documented in our journalism.
Well, my prediction is somebody smarter than me should buy the domain name New Conservatives, because I strongly suspect we might see the launch of that party soon, and you'll earn a lot of money from doing that. Let's take 2 questions from the floor. The gentleman in the grey top here, one back.
This one?
Yes, and also then after that, if we then, after you've asked your question, if we could just take the microphone over to the gentleman who's got the sort of sand-coloured jacket on, and we'll take 2 at once, if that's all right.
Okay, lovely to be here tonight. I mean, the situation we are in now is mirrored globally in all countries that we like to think democratic. It isn't just us. And when we vote, we don't just vote for parties, we endorse the institutional design that is the framework behind parties. And this is why it's so hard to achieve anything, any radical change. The problem is within parties. Parties are adversarial. They operate in a complete vacuum of any shared deliberation or expression of doubt. And it was never written in stone that politics be the prerogative of politicians. There are many out there that can do much better, but don't choose a career in politics. Citizens' assemblies.
Your question is?
Is that it?
What is your question?
All right. We have to focus on that and realize that if we want change, I think there has to be much greater people engagement. There are citizens' assemblies happening all around the world, outside of government. Why are they happening outside of government? Because people need to feel involved. They should be a part of government in some way or other.
Understood. Thank you very much, sir. If we take the question from the gentleman in the sand jacket, and then just after that, so the gentleman in the purple shirt.
Thank you. Very encouraged to have the role of the media and media culture brought up this evening. Wasn't expecting it. And it is a vast problem. A senior reporter, I probably shouldn't name, once said to me, get real. By the way, I'm in the Liberal Democrats Director of Reform News, Keith Sharp. I was once told, get real, the media mediates. 99.9% of the people only hear about politics through the media, and so you just better get on with it. So that being the case, includes social media in that, there is an ingrained culture. There are discussions taking place about tactical voting, and it's all why, how people, never is it put out that it's actually the political system that we have that drives people to tactical voting. And another one is, and speaking as a Liberal Democrat, we're getting a bit of stick at the moment for our bar charts, some of which are egregious, I accept. But what is not pointed out is that why do political parties do this? And why did Sadiq Khan go to a horse race place to say it's a 2-horse race for the mayoral election? It is the political system that drives that.
And what is your question?
How do we get the media to open up and break open this rather sort of self-satisfied culture of they know how to report it, that is the status quo, and they're not going to change?
I have thoughts on that, as I'm sure Hardeep does. We will definitely come to that. Sir, your question.
Hardeep mentioned the lack of scrutiny by the media, but I think we've also lost scrutiny in Parliament of political decisions and what government does in terms of decision making. So I guess my question is, would a more proportionate House remedy some of that if we had that plurality of parties? And in the short term, how do we tackle that if we have a supermajority?
Good questions, all of them. Let's start with, actually, I'd like to start with a question, and I'm hoping that you have thoughts on this. I don't know who does. I'm particularly interested in citizens' assemblies. Once spent a long time making a documentary about them and their effectiveness. How do we engage the public better in terms of politics, but also exerting, the whole point of citizens' assemblies, in terms of the prototype, is that they can exert direct influence over politicians. What are your thoughts on better engagement and perhaps allowing the general public or the voting public better exertion in between 5-year terms?
Okay, well, one issue on which on which I hope that we need a citizens' assembly is the issue of electoral reform. So the Labour Party, up till, and looking at the prospects for meaningful electoral reform, for proportional representation, my view, and the view of many people, has been that it's only really going to happen through a Labour government, because the Tories are so advantaged by first past post, apart from this time, but that they will never do it. Under first past the post, the other parties are so small that they're not really relevant. It's got to be driven by Labour. We're at this situation now where, thanks to a lot of hard work, actually, a huge majority of Labour Party members, a big majority of Labour Party voters are in favour. So, John, you mentioned that Keir Starmer's not interested. I think we should be a little bit more optimistic in that, and say that he's been very careful on the issue and has been really, has been sort of struggling to kind of not frighten the horses. But reading the Labour Party manifesto, I was very cheered to see that it mentions parliamentary reform, I think, or reform of Parliament. I was, gosh, it mentions a lot of other things as well, like votes at 16, etc., but it mentions this. Now, in Labour's previous policy documents, it does also talk about, not about saying that, electoral reform cannot be a top-down thing. It's got to be, there's got to be consultation. So I think on this issue, that we are likely to see, whether it's going to be in Labour's first term, I don't know. I would be very hopeful that they will start looking into it in their first term, and that they will introduce some sort of broad consultative process by which these things are discussed.
Maria, thank you. It's an interesting thing you raise about Sir Keir Starmer and his commitment or otherwise to electoral reform. I mean, the way I read his intentions was rather to hint at a possible interest in electoral reform, just in case they ended up having to form a coalition government with the Lib Dems. Perhaps I'm very wrong, but that was certainly the way I read it. May I ask you, John, the question from the gentleman in the purple shirt? He raises a very good question, actually, about how little proper scrutiny there is of policy and ideas and government. Do you think a more proportional House would allow that?
Can I respectfully disagree? We've just had a parliament that's brought down 2 prime ministers. We've got a parliament that came to the conclusion, despite having a majority of Conservative MPs, that Boris Johnson misled the House. And we have a much stronger system of select committees now than we used to have. And be aware that parliamentary accountability is not always popular. I mean, the House of Commons was extremely powerful in 2019. Public were deeply unhappy about the inability of the House of Commons to be able to make a decision, however. So that constant parliamentary politics where, House of Commons was arguably more powerful in some respects than it had been since 1945 was not a pretty sight. So just be aware that indecision, seeming indecision, particularly an indecision when you're facing a cliff edge, as we were on that occasion, it's not necessarily a pretty sight. It's not necessarily accepted by the public. And that despite what you might think of limitations of our current system, the internal, it's to do with the internal politics of the Conservative Party, yes, but the internal politics of the Conservative Party did serve to ensure that neither Boris Johnson nor Liz Truss survived. And there's no guarantee that a proportionate House would be any more effective than the current House has been in that respect.
Thank you. Hardeep, guess what's coming your way? If I've summarized your thought correctly, essentially what you have said is that you believe, sir, that there is a broken media system which is failing the public because we are simply not reporting politics properly. And how can that change or be changed? I suppose this isn't really the role of a chair, but I'm going to chip in if you don't mind. It is changing, and it's changing from the ground up. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Telegraph or the Guardian or BBC News, where I worked for many years, or LBC Radio or anywhere else. This is to do with a ground up movement, and it's called social media. It's called TikTok. It's called Instagram. It's called whatever the next platform is going to be. And it is hugely, hugely influential. It is particularly influential with a demographic that politicians and mainstream media have failed spectacularly to engage. And that change is coming, and it is irresistible. The question, I think, for the mainstream parties is how they're going to capture that and utilize it. And believe you me, they will be spending millions right now in trying to figure that out. But there is something enormously authentic about being able to take a camera, hold it, record it, and upload it directly. That is direct. I've experienced it myself. There is a direct connection that everyone from journalists to ordinary members of the public who are interested and engaged can build. And when it happens, it takes you by surprise. And the change is happening already. The question is, where does it go? Your thoughts?
So my thoughts are, I think that's a brilliant point, Sangita. I think old habits die hard, so I'm going to say something that is separate, but hopefully doesn't detract from that, but is quite separate, which is, all of that notwithstanding, we still have an established press in this country that does have a lot of influence. And that is not because lots of people are still buying the newspapers on the newsstands. That is, it's not that. It's not because they even think that who they endorse in an election will directly affect the public. You know, it is my analysis that it's not really about the public at all. I mean, let's go back to the fourth estate, what journalism is meant to be. It's meant to hold power to account, and it's meant to be outside of the system of politics, to be able to hold people in that system to account. So there's that aspect of it. But I also think journalism and the media it also creates the political and social culture in which we live, this water that we swim in. So it's both meant to be holding power to account, but it also has an incredible impact on how a lot of issues are framed, how the pictures people have in their heads of a certain issue, it is mediated through the media. And I think we really need to understand the structural forces that are at play here. And Byline Times analysis is that what we have seen, particularly in recent years, is a merger of the political media class. I mean, obviously there are all these issues about how the media reports on things, kind of a horse race reporting style of who's up, who's down, particularly given this general election campaign. But there is a deeper structural element here, that there's been a merger between the political media classes. You have journalists, so-called journalists, becoming politicians. You have journalists advising politicians. There is a revolving door between Downing Street and the offices of The Spectator, for example. These are structural forces. You know, their interests are converging, and I don't think many people know about that. And I think there are positives of social media, but there are also negatives of social media in terms of misinformation, disinformation, in terms of a lot of...
Well, eventually there will be state capture of social media. That's absolutely inevitable. And I don't mean that to sound as though it was something sinister. It's just if I was a major political party or a government, that's exactly what I would be doing now. They just haven't been very successful so far.
And social media is being used right now by all the political parties to pump out their campaign material, some of which is shown to be misleading. So I think it's not just the manner in which the journalists are operating, or the manner in which the reporting takes place. I think there are deeper structural forces that are very hard to explain to people, but we need to understand, because of course our media did a massive service in exposing the Partygate scandal, which really resonated with the public. But that was not the first thing that government should have been held to account over. There was all sorts of things going on about care homes, about the PPE that wasn't there. Austerity was completely accepted by most of the established press. It wasn't even questioned as to whether we should be having austerity in response to the financial crisis, which arguably is one of the underlying forces that led to Brexit. None of this is being properly looked at. And I'm saying that there are structural forces at play between people in positions of power, people in positions of power in the media, and how their interests are converging, which is completely separate from the public interest. And so I think we can have, you know, people suggest media reform. I think it's unlikely that a Labour government would come into power and reform the media in terms of regulation. But I do think there's a moment, because I do think that the established press, newspapers, they are losing their resonance. They're not influencing the public in the same way. People are getting their information from different sources. And I think it may be the moment where a Labour leader might stand up and say, write the headlines we're going to get on with the job. We're going to improve people's lives so they're not so susceptible to all sorts of things that are on the front pages that are trying to divide people. But yeah, I think this is a really important part of the conversation we need to have. We need to see how this stuff works to really understand what's at play. It is a struggle to do that.
I also think that it will take journalists like us
Yes.
talking about it honestly and openly. But actually, that's a very difficult thing to do. And I'm going to just augment a bit of what Hardeep said. I agree with everything that you have just said. But there are also practical considerations in terms of broadcast, for example. Broadcast news in this country is being starved of resources and it's dying on its feet. It means that there are fewer jobs and fewer journalists doing more work. And it's very, very difficult to apply the kind of scrutiny that we should be applying when there are just fewer of us. I think there is a big problem, and I can speak direct to broadcast, and that's where I spent nearly, God, I'm so old, nearly a quarter of a century. And what you will see is that political reporting has for too long been too much essentially gossip in the Westminster teacup, as far as I'm concerned, right? You can come away from having watched leading political journalists delivering 1 minute 30 to camera, and you come away none the wiser to your point about policy scrutiny, right? Jobs are going very, very fast. It is now not possible for someone like me, who came from a background where we didn't have any money. I got to university only because of a grant, and had it not been for that, I wouldn't have had a higher education. Had I not been able to win scholarships, win an apprenticeship for the BBC, I wouldn't be a journalist, right? Those opportunities have gone. They have gone. So we need to be really aware of who is entering the supply chain. Who are the legacy journalists? Who is it that is going to be reporting on the people in power? All of this stuff, it's a huge conversation and we must have it. And actually, it's a real pleasure and delight to be sitting on a panel with somebody, I've never met Hardeep before, to be sitting on a panel with somebody else who's prepared to just say it out loud, knowing potentially that you may never get employed again, right? That's what we're talking about. I think we should also talk a bit, and we don't have time, the other things you need to bear in mind. Media barons, it's not just newspapers, increasingly it's broadcast. Think about that and think about the impact on the way in which our media is and our politics is being reported. That's not from me. More questions from I'll tell you what, could we, yes, absolutely, go for it.
Hi, I'm Caitlin from Politics Home. John, you touched on it already, but can you see a future within the next parliament where the issue of PR is a Conservative policy issue explicitly rather than an issue that's on the left, whether that be Labour or the Liberal Democrats? And based on the principles and the data that you've been talking about this evening, are there any other major policy issues that in the case of a large Labour majority you can see switch from being a priority on the right to the left or vice versa, from the left to the right?
I can answer the first part of your question. I'm not sure I can do the second part. I mean, history would suggest that you will discover the Conservative Party now starts to create an interest. I mean, the interest started between 1974 and 1979. Lord Hailsham's talk of elected dictatorships. So there was already quite considerable interest at that point. And then when it looked as though the SDP might steal the march on everybody, Conservative campaign on electoral reform was very active and then all disappeared in the wake of the 1983 election. But I mean, this is not unique to this country. It's a general principle that support for changing the system tends to be higher amongst those who support parties that lost last time. All right, it's just human nature, I'm afraid. Nothing wrong with the system if it puts your side in. Right? It's like you know, people are not going to want to change the VAR system if it thinks it does them good, and they're going to want to change the VAR system if they think it's denied them goals. Yeah. I mean, on the second one, I mean, I would just slightly distinguish about, you know, how right-wing the Conservative Party is. I mean, the Conservative Party, there's certainly I mean, the politics of the Conservative Party is a bit more complicated than just left or right? So they're basically the Conservative Party, like much of our society, is bifurcated on two dimensions. So there are some people who are Trussites, who are very right-wing on economics, who cannot stand the socially conservative right inside the Conservative Party because they regard them as too interventionists, because they want to use the state to impose a certain cultural and moral outlook, right? And equally, some of those who are on the in the center, or you know, the center right on economic issues, may well be relatively liberal on some of the social issues. And you know, that this just cuts across the Conservative Party very strongly. So I suspect that for a whole variety of reasons that the Conservative Party may well move in a more socially conservative direction. But whether it will prove more right-wing is another matter. It's actually become more right-wing during this parliament. I mean, people tend to forget that Boris Johnson was no right-winger in terms of his attitudes towards the state. Boris Johnson was happy to intervene like Michael Hasseltine yesterday and today and tomorrow. He wanted to use the power of the state in order to change society. It's his successors, Truss and Sunak, but obviously particularly Truss, who are much more right-wing economically.
Thank you. Are there any women that would like to ask a question?
We just had one, by the way.
Oh, I know. I don't know. I feel that if you're a journalist, we can kind of discount ourselves this evening.
They're coming online.
They're coming online. Grace.
So yeah, we had Sally, who was asking about taxable voting. Is it on the rise? Would it make a difference? Etc. Take that as you want to. And we also had Claudia, who asked about compulsory voting. What does the panel think of that? Again, would it potentially make a difference to the dynamics?
I noticed this lady purple. Does it add you on today?
Mine's a pragmatic question, really, about the best way to get the incoming government, which we do definitely think is going to be one particular party, to actually take some action. And I'm wondering whether the panel agrees with me that probably the most cogent argument in favour of getting the Labour Party to take on PR is that if they want a second term to get any of what they want actually done, then probably they're going to need a more proportional approach.
John, I'm going to ask you to take that first, and then I'll come to the other two questions. We are running a little over time. If you are interested and engaged enough to stay, we're going to run until about 8:30, if that's all right.
Yes, you are, I think, alluding to what we might call the Mitterrand strategy. So when the socialists looked as though they were going, I forgot which year, I think it was before 1986 anyway, but looked as though they were going to lose, they switched to the electoral system from the two-ballot system, which is essentially a majoritarian system, to the system of proportional representation in order to reduce their losses. Question is, however, whether or not a party is going to be sufficiently fleet of foot to make that move, because the problem on the other side is going to be that if we do have a Labour Party with a large overall majority, there will be a lot of Labour MPs there who will go, if I vote for this, I'm voting for Christmas. I'm like a turkey voting for Christmas. So you may well be right that there might well be an institutional interest to the Labour Party if it finds itself relatively unpopular during the course of the next parliament, which some of us think is kind of quite a serious risk, and that therefore, as collectively, would be in their interest to make a move on the system But the question is whether or not that might be overruled by the individual rationality of Labour MPs in whose interest the switch may not lie. So how that tension will play out is another matter.
Thank you. Maria, I'm fascinated by this idea of compulsory voting. Should people be forced to vote?
Well, there are some countries where voting is in theory at least compulsory, and where in theory at least you can get fined. And it is true that voter turnout is much higher in those countries. For the UK, at the moment, I think it's a terrible idea. Number one, you know, if the government really wanted to sort of increase the franchise, it should definitely look at increasing voter registration, because the sort of, you know, the ways that voter registration is done at the moment, it does form a kind of voter suppression, actually. And it would be very, very easy to introduce automatic voter registration. It is the norm in many countries. Now, we're a little bit hampered in this country because we don't have a sort of ID card registration, but it would be perfectly easy to do via many other public records, and that should definitely be step one. Under first past the post, it would be absolutely dreadful to introduce compulsory voting, because the whole problem with first past the post is that so many people's votes don't count. So are you really going to introduce a system that says, okay, you've got to go out to vote, even though for many people it doesn't count, and we will fine you, or worse, in theory at least, if you don't go out to vote? You know, how could we possibly do that? So automatic voter registration, absolutely. Get rid of first past the post and give people a really good incentive, make everybody's votes count. Absolutely. Compulsory voting, no, certainly not yet.
Thank you. Tactical voting, fascinating. Huge, huge social media campaign, certainly, to encourage people to tactically vote. Do either of you think it's going to make any difference?
Well, it depends on what you mean by difference here. And the honest truth is that it doesn't look as though you need to gang up on the Conservative Party for it to suffer a defeat, because that's the direction which is going anyway. Anyway, some of the
They successfully ganged up on themselves.
some of the mega polls do suggest that tactical voting is going on, tactical switching is going on, and that a couple I've gone through in detail, you see the Liberal Democrats advancing insofar as they're advancing anyway. They're advancing in places where they're second to the Conservatives, and Labour are doing rather better. So that problem the Conservatives have of their vote falling more heavily in places where they're trying to defend is potentially going to be compounded by tactical voting. Tactical voting did start to appear in the local elections of 2023 and beginning of May. You could see very clearly voters voting tactically against the Conservatives. The last time we saw tactical voting of that kind in local elections was before the 1997 general election, and the 1997 general election did see tactical voting make more difference than it had done at any previous election. So it could well be true that tactical voting will compound the difficulties that the Conservative Party faces in this election.
Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I've seen the gentleman in the stripy shirt behind. Got to get your question in before we wrap.
We like your point about the social media as well. I'm Matt Bogle from Electoral Reform Society. My question to the panel is, do you think the scrapping of voter ID and bringing in votes for 16-year-olds can really make a difference in the electoral reform of the country?
Oh dear, I'm going to make myself deeply unpopular now. I am
Not
not
possible.
I am not in the voter ID is necessarily a bad idea camp. I mean, the problem we've got with it, however, is that the two sides in the argument have got rather entrenched with each other. So, you know, we know that the Electoral Commission for the 2023 local elections in England, which is the only researched evidence we've got so far, if I remember correctly, reckoned that 0.2% of the electorate turned up to the polling station, were denied a ballot paper because they didn't have the ID and failed to return, which seems like a very small number. Problem is, of course, I'll get to the other side of the argument, don't worry. The problem is, of course, that if you're opposed to voter ID, you then say, oh, but hang on, some returning officers rather helpfully have people outside the polling stations, and they therefore told people they didn't have the ID, so therefore they turned away. To which argument you then add, But then, of course, some people, knowing they didn't have the ID that was required, didn't bother to even go to the polling station in the first place. And of course, neither of these latter two things is possible to prove or disprove. So therefore, both sides will continue down silos. Beyond that, I would say we do need to be, I would entirely accept the argument that there isn't a serious problem about impersonation in this country, though there was in Northern Ireland, which is why it was originally introduced there. It was perfectly clear in Northern Ireland that the dead voted. However, if you think about international standards for electoral practice, if OECD send election observers to Russia or anywhere else as they once were able to doing so, one of the things that they were doing was, is there a proper system of voter ID to people to prove who they are? So by international standards, we were lax. It's partly a historical accident about how the system evolved in the Victorian era. That said, I think it was extremely unfortunate it was introduced on a partisan basis, that it would be much better if there was agreement between the parties about how to do this, and that there was agreement about what should be valid forms of ID. Although in the end, how far the fact that a young person's bus pass doesn't count and an older person's bus pass does, I think one of the things that seems to be now beginning to be implicitly accepted is that young people are so used to having to prove their age that they're actually going around with the ID. Whereas if you get into your 70s and your 80s and you can't get on a bus anymore and you can't get on an airplane anymore, you don't bother to keep your passport up to date and you ain't got your bus pass. So whether or not this is really having the impact that people perhaps feared is debatable, but I would certainly accept to be much better if it was on a bipartisan basis. Although, of course, again, it comes back to the point earlier about electoral registration. We don't have ID cards in this country. If we had ID cards, which is what most countries use in order to do voter ID in elections, then life would be much straightforward. And I'm not arguing in favor of ID cards, but you have to realize if you're opposed to ID cards, there is a price to be paid in terms of coming up with an adequate system of voter ID that seems to be fair and equitable across the population.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to be as unpopular as you because I'm pretty much in your camp. I mean, if you're happy to be ID'd to get into a nightclub, you know, it's okay at the polling station, surely. Hardeep, and then Maria, and I'm going to ask you to keep your answers fairly brief.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting that none of these arguments, Sir John, were advanced by the government in any prominent way when they quietly introduced voter ID. The most that the government spokespeople tell journalists is that it is to stop issues of voter fraud, of which there are very, very few in the last general election. Why did we not hear any of these arguments is curious. Why did a former cabinet minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg, suggest at a public event that parties have engaged in forms of gerrymandering, which have arguably backfired in their favor in relation to a question about Labour and votes for under 16s? That is interesting. I mean, again, no one wants to report about that. In the local elections recently, Byline Times is running an investigatory project called Vote Watch and encourage members of the public to get in touch. One man was not able to vote because the only form of ID he had showed him clean shaven, and in the 2 years since the photo was taken, he had grown a beard. This is people not having their vote, and we now have about 15 days or 15 working days until there is a general election in this country where everyone will need to present ID. I think the manner in which it was introduced was partisan. The intentions need to be questioned. I think that is going to have an impact on people who will not be able to vote. And again, it's this weaponization of the system and to when it serves you. And so this point about when people are in favor of changing it in their favor and when they're not is a very curious question.
But Maria, you've obviously read the relevant section of the Labour manifesto, and I haven't. Is there anything in there about getting rid of the voter ID regulations?
No.
Right.
Anybody. The big problem is a sort of ratchet effect, because having introduced the voter ID registration, voter ID thing, nobody can then say we're going to abolish it, because obviously then you're open to, oh, well, you just want
it's easier
anybody.
to abolish than it is to introduce.
Well, yes, but you open yourself up to so much criticism to say, oh, well, you're just wanting voter fraud then. However, the Labour manifesto does say some things about making it more even. So, you know, removing this discrepancy, for example, between the young and the old person's bus pass.
Because the Electoral Commission is in favour of voter ID, but it's not, it wasn't in favour of the way in which it was introduced. So I think, you know, and that's obviously relatively safe ground to improve
And on that note, like so many.
Yeah, could I just say something about the votes at 16? Because you did ask about that. And that is, again, that's in the Labour manifesto as well. And it seems to be quite, you know, quite a firm commitment to that. Now, and I think this is really interesting because one argument that is advanced for lowering the voting age to 16 is that people will still be at school when it's their first time to vote, and that they can therefore gently be sort of encouraged into it to get the habit by a program of civics lessons and things like that. And so, and of course, actually that has been to some degree, at least, the experience in Scotland. So, you know, it's really worth considering because of that. So, you know, I think that's a great development. And I would be very much in favor of that. Having said that, I think you need more than simply lowering the age and doing the civics lessons. You know, when push comes to shove, if you really want to improve voter turnout, you've got to make it worth people's while to vote. And we have to get rid of the voting system, which means that so many people's votes count for absolutely nothing. And, you know, so votes at 16, yes, but below that, there is something that's even more important.
Maria, thank you very much indeed. And on that note, we end this conversation. It's been my absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you all for staying for the extra 17 minutes that we've overrun. I do appreciate it. So thank you from me and all of our audience. Maria, John, Hardeep, thank you. It's been a fascinating evening. It's been my pleasure to be here.